The community had always known how to cope with winter. At least, that's what everyone believed. For generations, the same methods had worked. Firewood stockpiled in the summer, roofs reinforced in the fall, walls caulked before the first snow. No one questioned it. No one needed to. Until, that year, a woman began building something no one could understand. While the men reinforced beams and families organized provisions, she erected a structure of wood and plastic around her own cabin. A greenhouse, not for plants, for herself. The news spread quickly, accompanied by muffled laughter and pitying glances. Some thought she had gone mad. Others simply ignored her, as they always did. But no one, absolutely no one, took it seriously. She wasn't important enough to be taken seriously. She lived alone in the last cabin before the forest, far from the center where decisions were made. She had no voice in meetings. She had no family to defend her. She had no history of great deeds or achievements that would justify attention. She was just another silent, functional, forgettable presence. The kind of person who lives on the margins not by dramatic choice, but by gradual abandonment. And now, seeing that fragile structure growing around her house, the community found yet another reason to discard her. The greenhouse was the final proof that she didn't understand what she was doing, that she was wasting time and resources on something useless. That winter would break her, as it breaks everything that doesn't withstand the right conditions. But inside that isolated cabin, as the first gusts of cold wind began to sweep across the dry earth, the woman felt no doubt, only clarity. She had seen the signs that others ignored. The behavior of the birds migrating earlier, the deep moisture that the soil retained even under the sun, the subtle changes in the wind that blew from unusual directions. This winter would not be like the previous ones, and when it came, tradition would not be enough. She knew this with a certainty that needed no external validation, because she had learned over the years that trusting others meant being unprepared, and this time she would not be. The region where she lived had no official name on maps, only a generic designation that appeared in old documents. It was a narrow valley surrounded by low hills, where the wind always found a way to blow through. In summer, the place breathed green and gold with fields stretching to the tree line. But when autumn arrived, the transformation was swift and brutal. The colors died in a matter of weeks. The sky grew lower, heavier, as if the light itself were losing its power. The cold began as a suggestion in the mornings, then settled in completely, clinging to the skin, penetrating clothes, making each breath a conscious act. The community was 3 kilometers away, a cluster of 15 huts around a central warehouse. That was where everything happened, the conversations, the exchanges, the decisions. She rarely went there. Her cabin was small, built of pine planks that had darkened with age. The roof was made of metal shingles patched in several places, and the stone chimney released thin smoke during the cold months. Inside, the space was functional. A bed against the wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves full of tools, tin cans, and technical books stacked without apparent order. There was no decoration, no unnecessary comfort. Everything there served a purpose. The south-facing window was the only large one, and she kept it clean, watching the sky every morning. The floor creaked under her feet. The wind whistled through the cracks. During the winter, the internal temperature dropped so low that her breath formed white clouds even near the fireplace. She knew every flaw in that structure, and she knew that, without change, that winter would kill her. Emotionally, she occupied an awkward place in the community. She wasn't hated, she wasn't loved, she was tolerated. People greeted her when necessary, but no one sought her out. No one asked how she was, no one invited her to anything. She had learned at a young age that her presence was dispensable, that her opinions didn't matter, that she could disappear for weeks and no one would notice. This didn't sadden her the way it used to. Now it was just a fact, like the cold, like the rain. She had grown accustomed to living alone, not out of philosophical preference, but out of practical necessity. Depending on others always ended in disappointment, always ended in silence. So she stopped depending. And in this forced isolation, she developed something rare, the ability to observe without social filters, to see what was happening Not what everyone said was happening. Her closest neighbors were a middle-aged couple who raised chickens and an older man who worked with wood. They saw her as strange, polite but strange. She didn't talk much, she didn't share stories, she didn't laugh at jokes. When she crossed paths with someone, the silence between them was uncomfortable, filled only by the sound of boots on the ground. She knew what they thought of her. She knew they considered her inadequate, weak, perhaps, or just too different to be included. And for years, that was enough to keep her away. But something changed that autumn. Maybe it was the accumulation of signs she saw. Maybe it was the weariness of barely surviving, winter after winter. Or maybe it was simply the clarity that if she didn't do something different, she wouldn't make it past next March. She began gathering materials in silence. Leftover wood from old renovations, sturdy plastic bought in the nearest town, a 2-hour drive away. Nails, screws, hinges, everything stored in the back of the cabin, out of sight. She didn't explain anything to anyone. She didn't ask for help. She didn't seek approval. She just prepared. And as she did this, she felt something growing inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was cold, calculated determination. The certainty that this time she would do things the right way, her way. And if others didn't understand, the problem wouldn't be hers anymore. It would be theirs. The decision to build the greenhouse around the cabin wasn't impulsive. She spent weeks studying, calculating, and measuring. She read about thermal insulation, about how air acts as a barrier when trapped between layers. She studied the angle of the sun during winter, how light could be captured and retained. She drew blueprints on scrap paper, recalculated, and adjusted the measurements. The idea was simple in theory, to create a second skin around the cabin, an intermediate space that would act as a thermal buffer. The sun's heat would warm the air between the greenhouse and the outer wall of the house during the day. At night, this heat would be trapped, prevented from escaping by the layers of reinforced plastic and the careful sealing. It wasn't magic. It was basic physics. But when she finally began building, erecting the first wooden posts around her house, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. It was madness. The first to laugh was the man who worked with wood. He passed by her property carrying planks and stopped, observing the unfinished structure with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. He made a loud comment, as if she weren't there. He said he'd never seen anyone waste material like that, that greenhouses were for tomatoes, not for people. Other neighbors soon found out. The news spread through the central store like wildfire. The women talked amongst themselves while buying groceries. The men shook their heads, serious, as if witnessing an obvious mistake they couldn't prevent. Some tried to disguise their mockery with feigned concern, asking if she was all right, if she needed help rethinking it. But the tone was clear. Nobody believed her. Nobody supported her. Everyone thought she was making a costly and ridiculous mistake. The criticisms were consistent. They said the plastic wouldn't withstand the wind, that the first storm would tear everything apart, that the weight of the accumulated snow would cause the entire structure to collapse on the cabin, making everything even worse. They said the heat would escape at night anyway, because plastic doesn't retain anything, that she was throwing money away, that the cabin, as it was already sufficient, after all it always had been, that reinforcing the roof and stockpiling more firewood was the proven method, tested by generations, that innovating was risky, that trying something different, especially something so strange, was arrogance or desperation. And she, of all people, lacked the credibility to challenge what had always worked. She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a builder. She had no recognized experience. She was just a woman alone doing something that nobody understood. And that, in itself, was reason enough to dismiss the idea. She listened to everything in silence. She didn't answer. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to explain the logic behind each choice. She just kept working. Every morning she woke before sunrise and resumed construction. She erected beams, fixed plastic, sealed joints. Her hands became rough, bruised, covered in small cuts. Her back ached at the end of the day. But she didn't stop. The structure grew slowly, methodically, precisely. She knew that every centimeter mattered, that every poorly done seal would be a flaw in the winter, that there was no room for error. And while the neighbors laughed and commented, she tightened screws, reinforced bases, checked angles, not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, but because she was absolutely certain that she was right. And that certainty didn't need witnesses. The antagonism didn't stem from pure malice. It came from fear disguised as tradition. The community functioned because everyone did the same things, in the same way, at the same times. To deviate from this was to threaten cohesion. It was to suggest that the old way might be wrong, and nobody wanted to admit that. So it was easier to ridicule, disqualify, push away, to transform difference into madness. And she knew this. She knew it wasn't about her, but about what she represented. The possibility that everything they believed in might not be enough. But that didn't change anything. She wasn't building to prove something to them. She was building to survive. And when winter came, the only thing that would matter would be whether the greenhouse worked or not. The rest was just noise. Building the greenhouse required planning that went far beyond simply covering the cabin with plastic. It began by measuring the ideal distance between the exterior wall of the house and the new structure. She decided on 1 meter and 20 centimeters of free space on all sides. This air gap would be crucial, large enough to allow circulation and heat retention, small enough not to waste solar heating. She marked the ground with stakes and string, creating a perfect rectangular perimeter. Then she dug deep holes for the main posts, going beyond the frost line. Each post was treated with used oil at the base to resist moisture. She secured them with hand-mixed concrete, using an old rusty cement mixer that barely turned anymore. The work was slow, heavy, and lonely. Her shoulders burned. Her hands developed blisters that burst and formed calluses. But each post erected was a small, silent victory. Next came the horizontal beams that would connect the posts, forming the roof structure. She chose treated pine wood, cut to specific dimensions. Each joint was reinforced with bolted metal angle brackets. Nothing could give way. Nothing could sway. The structure's rigidity would be tested by wind and snow, and any weakness would mean total collapse. She worked alone most of the time, using ropes and improvised pulleys to lift the heaviest beams. At times, the sheer physics of weight almost overcame her, but she adjusted the angle, redistributed the load, tried again. There was no rush. There was only the work. And at the end of each day, when the sun set behind the hills and the temperature plummeted, she entered the cabin, covered in sawdust and sweat, ate something simple, and slept the deep sleep of someone who pushes their body to its limit. The plastic was the most delicate part. She didn't use just one layer. She installed 2 layers of heavy-duty plastic film with 10 centimeters of space between them. This intermediate space would act as additional insulation, creating a double barrier against the cold. The first layer was attached to the outside of the wooden structure, carefully stretched to avoid wrinkles that would accumulate snow. The second layer was installed internally, sealed with industrial staples and cold temperature-resistant tape. Each seam was overlapped and sealed 3 times. There could be no tears. There could be no weak points. She worked on her knees, on her stomach, in uncomfortable positions, checking every centimeter. The plastic made a noise as it was stretched, a high-pitched sound that echoed in the silence of the valley. And while she worked, she felt the wind testing the structure, pushing, pulling, as if it were already trying to destroy what wasn't even finished yet. The ventilation was meticulously planned. She installed small, movable windows on the sides of the greenhouse, made with wooden frames and double-layered plastic. These windows could be opened during the day, when the sun overheated the interior space, and closed completely at night to retain every degree of accumulated heat. Each window had a simple locking system, made with metal hooks that she herself bent and adjusted. In addition, she created drainage channels in the ground around the entire base of the greenhouse. These channels were shallow, covered with small stones, and directed the meltwater away from the foundation. She knew that accumulated snow would eventually melt during warmer days, and this water could not pool, it could not seep in, It could not refreeze under the structure and create instability. Every detail was a precaution. Every choice was an anticipatory response to a problem that had not yet occurred. Inside, between the greenhouse and the cabin, she organized the space with a clear function. She stacked firewood along the north wall, creating an additional barrier against the cold wind that always came from that direction. She installed low shelves where she could store tools, preserves, and equipment that couldn't freeze. She left a meter-wide corridor around the entire cabin, allowing circulation and access to any outside point. She set up a small workbench near the greenhouse entrance where she could make repairs without having to go out into the cold. Everything had its place. Everything had a purpose. She wasn't decorating. She was building a survival system, and each element of that system needed to function in harmony with the others, because the failure of one would mean the failure of all. Throughout the entire process, no one offered help. Some passed by and watched from afar, shaking their heads. Others made comments amongst themselves, loud enough for her to hear. They said she was wasting her time, that she could be reinforcing the real cabin, the right way, that all this was too much work for something that wouldn't work. She didn't respond to any comments. She didn't justify any choice. She just continued. Hammering, sawing, sealing, adjusting. The sound of the work became constant in that part of the valley. And as the structure became complete, something strange happened. It seemed increasingly solid, more real, more inevitable. It was no longer a joke. It was a physical presence that could not be ignored. And that bothered the community more than anything else. When she finally finished, on the last day of October, the greenhouse was complete. From the outside, it looked strange, out of place, almost alien. A transparent bubble around a dark wooden cabin. The plastic gleamed in the dim autumn light. The wind made the structure groan softly, but it didn't budge. She walked around, checking every fastening point, every seal, every joint. She tested the ventilation windows, opening and closing them several times. She entered the intermediate space and stood there, feeling the temperature difference. It was already a few degrees warmer inside than outside, and winter hadn't even begun yet. She allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Not pride, just the confirmation that she had done what needed to be done. And now all that remained was to wait. If someone asked me why I keep sharing stories like this, I'd say it's because they need to be heard. If that makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more stories like this to the channel. Winter began as it always did, with a sudden drop in temperature in the first week of November. The sky turned uniformly gray, without nuances, without depth. The wind changed direction, now coming directly from the north, sharp and dry. The first frosts appeared overnight, covering the grass with a thin layer of white crystals that melted by midday. The community reacted with its usual routine. They lit fireplaces earlier. They donned heavy coats. They closed windows that had been left open during the autumn. They checked the woodpile. They inspected the roof. They made sure everything was as it should be. No one seemed worried, just prepared. Winter was a known adversary, predictable, manageable. They knew what to do. They always had. In the cabin surrounded by the greenhouse, the change was perceived differently. During the day, even with the weak November sun, the space between the greenhouse and the house wall heated up considerably. The temperature inside rose 10, 12 degrees above the outside. The air became dense, almost heavy, laden with accumulated heat. She would open the ventilation windows for a few hours, letting the excess escape and preventing it from getting too hot. At night, when she closed everything completely, the retained heat remained. Inside the cabin, the temperature was noticeably higher than in previous years. She still needed the fireplace, but the fire didn't need to be as large. The firewood lasted longer. The coal didn't penetrate the walls as before. It was a subtle but real difference. And she wrote everything down in an old notebook, recording temperatures, times, and the system's behavior. Not out of vanity, but out of a need to understand exactly how it worked. The first signs that something was different came in mid-November. The temperature dropped faster than expected. In 3 days, it went from tolerable cold to penetrating cold. The kind of cold that hurts your lungs when you take a deep breath. People started commenting, but still without real alarm. Just casual observations that it was colder than usual, that the firewood was being consumed faster, that perhaps it was going to be a longer winter. But nothing that justified concern, nothing that required a change of plans. They had enough firewood, they had food stored, they had experience. A colder winter was just that. Colder. It wasn't a catastrophe. It wasn't a threat. It was just additional discomfort, and discomfort could be tolerated. But then the snow began. Not the light, scattered snow of early winter. Heavy, wet snow that fell in large flakes and clung to everything. The first snowfall lasted 2 whole days. It covered the ground with a 30-centimeter layer of compact snow. It blocked the roads. It isolated the cabins. People stayed indoors, waiting for it to pass. And it did. But 3 days later, it snowed again. And then again, and again. Each snowfall added another 10-15 centimeters. The accumulated snow began to weigh down the roofs. Some residents climbed up to remove the excess, working with shovels on top of slippery and dangerous structures. Others reinforced internal supports, placing additional beams under critical points. Activity in the community increased. It wasn't panic, but it was no longer a quiet routine. Inside the greenhouse, snow accumulated on the surface of the plastic, but trickled down the sloping sides she had planned. The weight never concentrated. The structure groaned under the load, but didn't give way. And beneath the white layer that covered everything, the system continued to function. During the day, even with the cloudy sky, some sunlight pierced the snow and warmed the air inside. At night, the heat was trapped, prevented from escaping by the multiple layers of protection. The temperature difference between inside and outside the greenhouse was already over 15 degrees. She could literally see the contrast. When she opened the greenhouse door to go out, the thermal shock was immediate. The outside cold bit her exposed skin in seconds. And when she went back inside, the relief was physical, almost palpable. The system was working better than she had expected, and this, strangely, worried her. Because if it was working so well in that cold, it meant that the cold outside was worse than any forecast. December arrived with a brutality that no one in the community could remember ever seeing before. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a single night. The outside thermometer showed numbers that seemed misread, minus 25 degrees, then minus 30. The wind blew relentlessly, creating an even lower wind chill. Everything froze. The water in the buckets turned to solid ice in minutes. Clothes hanging outside became stiff as boards. The very air seemed to crystallize, burning the throat and lungs with every breath. People left their homes only when absolutely necessary, rushing between the cabin and the woodshed, between the cabin and the well. Every movement outside was an exposure to risk, and inside the houses, even with the fireplaces burning continuously, the cold began to penetrate. The walls sweated frozen dampness. The floor was icy even near the fire. Discomfort turned into real suffering. The firewood, which was supposed to last until March, was being consumed at an alarming rate. Some families realized they wouldn't have enough. They began rationing the fire, letting the fireplace die down overnight, covering themselves with whatever blankets were available and enduring the cold in bed. Others tried burning old furniture, pieces of fence, any wood they could find. But green or treated wood didn't burn properly, producing toxic smoke and clogging the chimneys. One man had to climb onto the roof during a snowstorm to unclog the chimney, almost falling and nearly dying of hypothermia in the process. The children began to get sick, dry coughs that wouldn't go away, low, persistent fevers. The elderly suffered from joint pain that became unbearable. The community, which had always prided itself on its resilience, was beginning to show cracks. The pipes froze in the second week of December, first in the more remote cabins, then in the central ones. The water simply stopped flowing. People tried to thaw the pipes with hot cloths with controlled fire, but the ice was deep, beyond the reach of any improvised method. Some pipes cracked under the pressure of the expanding ice. When they finally thawed, water leaked into the walls, creating another problem. Without running water, people went back to fetching water from the central well, breaking the surface ice layer every morning with pickaxes. The water was so cold it hurt to hold the bucket. Carrying frozen water back home through the deep snow became an exhausting and dangerous task. People slipped. They got hurt. They lost entire buckets that rolled down the slope. Exhaustion settled over everyone like a heavy fog. The heating systems began to fail. A diesel generator stopped working because the fuel solidified. Another burned out its engine trying to operate at temperatures for which it wasn't designed. The fireplaces, overloaded by constant use, began to show structural problems. Stones cracked, mortar crumbled, smoke leaked into the houses. People improvised desperate repairs, but without adequate materials, without proper tools, everything was a makeshift solution, and the cold continued, relentless, indifferent. With each passing day, it became clearer that this winter was different. It wasn't something that could be resisted with determination alone. It wasn't something that tradition could solve. It was a force that demanded adaptation, and the community wasn't adapted. Food became a problem, not because there was a shortage, but because the extreme cold affected storage. Vegetables froze and became unusable when thawed. Canned goods cracked as the internal liquid expanded. Some families lost weeks' worth of provisions in a single night. Others tried to keep food near the fireplace to prevent freezing, but this created a risk of spoilage from excessive heat. There was no balance, there was no safe zone. It was either too cold or too hot. And with each loss, anxiety increased. People began to do mental calculations. How much is left? How long until spring? Will it be enough? Conversations in the central warehouse, in the rare moments when someone managed to get there, were tense, short, dominated by poorly disguised worry. And then the structural failures began. A roof gave way under the accumulated weight of snow, partially collapsing onto the interior of a cabin. No one was injured, but the house became uninhabitable. The family had to move to relatives' house, overcrowding an already small space. Another cabin developed cracks in its walls, allowing the wind to enter freely. The residents tried to enclose it with cloths, with wood, but the cold still found its way in. The feeling of security, which had previously come from the solidity of the structures, began to evaporate. The houses, which had always protected them, now seemed fragile, and if a crack could appear there, it could appear anywhere. No one was truly safe. No one could completely relax. Throughout all this, the greenhouse remained intact. Seen from the outside, covered in compacted snow, it seemed almost invisible, integrated into the white landscape. But inside, the system functioned with mechanical precision. The temperature in the intermediate space fluctuated between 5 and 10 degrees above zero, even when it was 30 degrees below zero outside. Inside the cabin, with the fireplace moderately lit, the temperature remained comfortable. She didn't need to burn furniture. She didn't need to ration fire. She didn't wake up with her breath freezing in the air. The pipes she had insulated with extra layers of protection didn't freeze. The food stored in the temperate space of the greenhouse remained usable. She still went out to fetch water, but quickly returned to the retained warmth. Every element she had planned, every detail that others had ridiculed, was fulfilling its function. And, although she felt no satisfaction at the failure of others, she felt the cold, hard confirmation that she was right. That winter was not normal, and those who hadn't prepared were paying the price. It was at the end of December that the first glances changed. People began to notice that smoke was still rising from the chimney of her cabin, but less than the others. That she could still move relatively well. She didn't seem as exhausted as everyone else. That the greenhouse, despite being covered in snow, hadn't collapsed. Some began to pass by her property, walking slowly, observing. They said nothing. They asked nothing. They just looked. And in those glances, there was something new. It wasn't respect yet. It wasn't admiration. It was curiosity mixed with something darker. Envy, perhaps, or the slow and painful realization that they had been wrong, that she had seen something they had ignored, and that now, in the midst of the most brutal winter they had ever faced, the difference between preparation and tradition was the difference between survival and collapse. There are times when we realize that being right brings no joy. It only brings the awareness of how different things could have been. If you understand this, leave a comment. Say where you're watching from. It makes a difference knowing that these stories reach people who truly understand. The rupture occurred one January morning when the thermometer read 32 degrees below zero and the wind howled with an intensity that made the walls tremble. A woman from the community, a mother of 2 small children, appeared at the greenhouse door. She didn't knock forcefully, just 3 weak, almost hesitant knocks, as if she were still deciding whether she should be there. When the door opened, the contrast was brutal. Outside, the cold cut like a blade. Inside, the air was warm, almost welcoming. The woman stood still for a moment, simply feeling the difference before speaking. Her voice was choked, not exactly with shame, but with something close to it. She said that her fireplace had cracked during the night, that smoke was filling the house, that the children were coughing incessantly, that she didn't know what to do anymore. She didn't ask for help directly, but the plea was in every word, in every pause, in every breath, visible in the icy air. She was received without questions, without verbal judgment. Just a silent gesture indicating that she should enter, bring the children, and stay as long as necessary. The woman ran back through the deep snow and returned minutes later with 2 small figures wrapped in blankets. The children were pale, trembling uncontrollably. Inside the warm space of the greenhouse, they gradually stopped trembling. The coughing subsided. Color returned to their faces. The mother sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and for a long moment simply breathed. She didn't say thank you. She didn't try to justify why she was there. She simply existed in that warmth, in that relief, in that pause from suffering. And in that silence, something changed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't dramatic reconciliation. It was simply the implicit recognition that the greenhouse worked, that the ridiculed decision had, after all, been the right one. The news spread quickly. Not because someone announced it, but because in small communities everything spreads. People knew the family was sheltered in the greenhouse. They knew they were safe, warm, out of immediate danger. And this created a wave of complex reactions. Some felt genuine relief, happy that the children were all right. Others found something harder to name. A mixture of shame, resentment, and the sharp pain of having to admit a mistake. For weeks, they had laughed. They had ridiculed. They had said it wouldn't work, and now, facing concrete evidence to the contrary, collective pride began to crumble, not explosively, but like ice that slowly cracks under constant pressure. In the following days, others began to appear. An elderly man whose heating system had completely failed, a couple who had lost part of their roof and had no way to repair it in the middle of winter. Each arrival was accompanied by the same hesitation, the same internal resistance to admitting that they needed it. No one arrived directly asking for shelter. They arrived with excuses. They said they only needed a place to warm their hands for a few minutes, that they just wanted to see how the structure was holding up against the snow, that they were just passing through. But everyone stayed, and everyone felt the same shock upon entering. The contrast between the slow death of the cold outside and the preservation of life inside. The greenhouse was not comfortable in the sense of luxury. The space was cramped. People slept on the floor, on makeshift blankets, but it was warm, and in the middle of that murderous winter, warmth meant survival. The final storm arrived in the 3rd week of January, heralded by a sky that darkened at midday as if night had come too early. The wind shifted direction again, now coming from the northwest with a force that bent old trees until they almost broke. The snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in dense curtains that obscured any visibility beyond 2 meters. The temperature plummeted to minus 38 degrees, the kind of cold that kills in minutes, the kind of storm that buries everything. People ran into their homes, locking doors, sealing windows, feeding fireplaces with all the firewood they still had. But in some cabins, there was no longer enough firewood. In others, the fireplaces were already too cracked to be used safely. And in still others, the cold had penetrated so deep into the walls that not even the fire helped anymore. The first family to abandon their home arrived at the greenhouse in the middle of the afternoon, braving their visible despair as they crossed the snowstorm. There were 4 of them, parents and 2 teenage children. They banged forcefully on the door, shouting to be heard above the wind. When they entered, they brought with them a blast of icy air that made everyone inside shiver. They were covered in snow, trembling violently, their lips purple. Between labored breaths, they explained that the roof had begun to collapse, that they had heard the wood cracking, that they couldn't stay another minute. The protagonist guided them to the space next to the cabin, where others were already sheltered. She arranged blankets. She distributed hot tea that she always kept prepared. She checked for signs of hypothermia. There was no drama. There were no speeches. Only practical actions, executed with the efficiency of someone who had planned for this exact scenario. Half an hour later, another family arrived. And then another, and another. People who had laughed at the greenhouse now rushed to it as a last resort. Some came alone, others in groups. All brought the bare minimum. Blankets, some clothes, food they could carry. The space inside the greenhouse, already cramped, became completely overcrowded. Bodies occupied every available inch of the intermediate space between the outer structure and the cabin. Adults sat leaning against the walls. Children huddled in improvised corners. The elderly stayed closer to the cabin entrance where the heat from the internal fireplace still reached. The air became thick with the breath of so many people. Moisture began to condense on the inner surfaces of the plastic, but the temperature remained. 5, 7, 10 degrees above zero. Cold by normal standards, warm enough to survive. The storm lasted 18 hours without a break. During that time, no one could leave. No one could check their own homes. They could only wait. The wind violently shook the greenhouse structure, making the plastic crack and vibrate. Snow accumulated in heavy layers on the sloping surface, but it ran down the sides exactly as planned. The beams groaned under the pressure, but did not break. The posts fixed deep in the ground did not give way. Every element of the system she had built was being tested simultaneously under extreme conditions, and every element was fulfilling its function. The ventilation windows, completely closed, prevented any heat loss. The drainage channels in the floor directed the meltwater that was beginning to form at the edges. The double layer of plastic created a barrier that the cold could not penetrate quickly. It was applied physics, basic engineering. But it worked. Within that cramped, hot space, something began to happen. People, forced into extreme proximity, began to talk. Not about the past, not about who was right or who was wrong, but about the immediate present, about how to distribute the blankets more fairly, about how to organize shifts so that everyone could rest a little, about how to ration the food they had brought so that it would last until the storm passed. The protagonist coordinated everything with practical calm, not as a leader seeking power, but as someone who simply knew what needed to be done. She pointed out where people could sit to maximize space. She showed how to open the internal ventilation for a few minutes when the air became too heavy. She explained, without condescension, how the system worked, why it was working, what could go wrong, and how to avoid it. And people listened. They really listened, because in there, surrounded by concrete evidence, there was no longer room for doubt. At the height of the storm, around 3 a.m, there was a moment of collective silence. The wind still howled. The snow still fell. But inside the greenhouse, the children had finally fallen asleep. The adults were quiet, some sleeping, others merely resting in silent vigil. The only light came from a small, battery-powered flashlight that someone had brought. And in that warm, cramped, improvised twilight, there was something that no individual cabin had anymore. Real security. Not the illusion of security based on tradition, but the physical certainty that, at that moment in that place, everyone was alive. And this certainty came directly from a decision that months before had been ridiculed. The weight of this irony didn't need to be verbalized. It was present in every breath, in every warm body, in every child who wasn't freezing to death. When the storm finally passed and the sun reappeared, weak but present, people slowly emerged from the greenhouse. blinking against the light reflected off the snow. The valley was transformed. Snow covered everything in layers that reached waist-high in some places. Several cabins had partially collapsed roofs. Others showed deep cracks in their walls. Trees had broken under the weight of the ice. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of snow falling from branches. People walked to their homes to assess the damage, and what they found confirmed what they already knew. Without the greenhouse, many would not have survived. It was no exaggeration. It was not dramatization. It was a simple and inevitable fact. The community had reached the limit of its traditional solutions, and that limit had been insufficient. In the following days, as winter continued but with less intensity, the social dynamic changed irreversibly. People began to seek out the protagonist, not out of immediate desperation, but for knowledge. They asked how she had calculated the spacing of the greenhouse, how she had chosen the type of plastic, how she had planned the ventilation. She answered with the same practical simplicity as always, without arrogance, without resentment for the previous treatment. She simply shared what she knew, and people took notes, memorized, and planned. Some began to discuss building similar structures for the next winter. Others talked about reinforcing their houses using similar principles. The greenhouse ceased to be seen as an eccentricity and became a model, and the woman who built it ceased to be the ignored stranger and became the one whose opinion mattered. The legacy of that winter wasn't just structural, it was emotional and collective. The community learned, without anyone needing to verbalize it, that survival doesn't come from blindly repeating the past, but from observing the present clearly and adapting with courage. That the most prepared person isn't always the most vocal or the most socially connected. That ignoring signs, because they contradict tradition, is a form of arrogance that can cost lives. And that humility, in the end, isn't admitting defeat, but recognizing reality. The greenhouse remained standing throughout the rest of the winter, occasionally sheltering those in need, functioning exactly as designed. And when spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing back the green, the structure was still there, not as a monument, but as a silent reminder that preparation is worth more than pride. It always has been, it always will be. Stories like this remind me that there are people who see what others ignore, who do what no one believes, and who save lives without expecting recognition. If you are one of those people, or if you know someone like that, follow the channel. We will continue sharing stories that demonstrate the power of silent preparation.